Hello there, this is my personal learning theory. I'm Stephen Tesh, I go by Scott. A real quick introduction. I'm an instructional designer with Dell EMC. I've got about 20 years working in instructional design, delivery, and evaluation. And before that, I taught ESL and software training. I'm a theater major, so that serves me well. The course must go on. So in terms of where I'm headed, why am I here? Well, I wanted to push myself out of my comfort zone and get exposure to some new and different viewpoints and practices. Wanted to learn about all the different learning theories and luminaries that I've overlooked. And I also wanted to eventually teach instructional design and technology at the community college or university level. Now, before we get started, a couple of quick caveats and warnings. I design, develop, and deliver for adult learners. So, adults, in my opinion, are not that different from children. And apologies to Piaget on that one. But I think that both can be curious, both can be aroused to learn as needed, both can be easily distracted, both are capable of learning whatever they're motivated to learn, and both can be motivated and feel pressed to learn very quickly when they need to. So some of my key beliefs. I want to be a disciplined eclectic, sort of taking bits and pieces from all of the best theories, which is why I like this particular approach in this class. I think a lot of learning theory, unfortunately, is highly impractical from an instructional design perspective, especially at the course level. We'll talk more about that in just a second. So I'm a situational learning theorist, trying to take the practical stuff I can from these theories. I think motivation is the single most important aspect of learning. Without it, it really doesn't matter if you have a really good learning program or not. But I think that motivation can't be manufactured. Motivation is something that is there because of a whole bunch of other reasons other than the course that you're delivering. So here are my beliefs as they relate to adult and child learners. I think adult learners require relevant outcomes. They have to feel that it's valuable to them in their role, whatever that role is, to become engaged. I think the more years equals more experience equals more knowledge and experience to draw from, but it also means more information to sift through and possibly more fear to distract learners. And children are kind of the opposite of that. Children require less orientation to their job or role, but they must still have curiosity aroused. I think less years equals more neural plasticity, meaning they can learn things very, very quickly, but they can also forget them just as fast. So what we'll do now is very quickly, in almost rapid fire format, go through a learning theory roundup. I have a lot of stuff here to talk about, so I'm going to try to do it as quickly as I can, and forgive me for talking fast if I do. Okay, now for each of these, I'm going to go over what I agree with, what I use, and what questions I might have about a particular theory. And I'll also talk about my take. Now I'm going to cover these very quickly. So first of all, with radical behaviorism, I agree in conditioned responses being powerful and part of our behavior. I think shaping, chaining, and discriminative learning are all fantastic things that I can use as an instructional designer. But the lack of focus on what's happening cognitively sort of hurts the breadth of the theory. I think cognition matters. So my take is that learners benefit from radical behaviorism, especially when there's a concrete learning goal with really measurable outcomes at play. Now we'll move on to social learning theory. I've got my picture here of Albert Bandura and his Bobo doll, which is one thing he used to demonstrate modeling behavior in children and adults. So I agree, observation and modeling behaviors are key to some kinds of learning, especially attitudinal learning, and self-efficacy really can determine learning success. So using observation, modeling, mentor and mentee programs, very good to use for me from social learning theory. My problem with social learning theory is I think it's true in theory, absolutely, but it's very difficult to reliably practice in the real world with any kind of consistency. So my take on it is that learners benefit from it at a curricular or institutional level. It's usually difficult to employ at a course or a lesson level. Now, cognitive information processing, I have here a picture of an Intel Core i7 processor because really it's all about how the brain processes and retains memory. It's very important and useful, these facts about memory, and I think it's useful to use pattern recognition and chunking in particular from CIP. But I don't think it's applicable in lots of non-cognitive contexts, like, for example, physical learning, uh, just not present there. So my take there is that learners benefit from CIP, particularly in highly cognitive tasks like learning a language or memorizing poems. Okay, motivation. I still believe it's the most important thing, especially for adult learners, but I think that it's the awareness of motivation and with self-regulated learning as a goal as the thing for me to take away as an instructional designer. What I can't commit to is some really ridiculous system um, that complicates the process. ARCS looks great on paper, but I think it's an incredibly complex system for something which is really just second nature and should be something you're thinking about all the time anyway. So motivation is almost everything in learning to me, but I think it's inspired at an organizational, institutional, or programmatic level. Very rarely is it at the course level. Okay, so here we're talking about schema theory, and you can see that I've got a picture of, the fact that gender stereotypes and stuff are schemas that we usually carry around with us, and they influence how we learn and what we think about what we do. So I definitely believe in schema theory. I think that things like pre-work and pre-course discussion are a great takeaway as an instructional designer that I can use to make sure that everybody's getting on the same sort of schema page in a course. But I do question how useful it is acknowledging all the different possible permutations of schema that are in a real classroom, because there could be so much diversity that it becomes kind of meaningless, this pursuit of understanding everyone's schema. So I think learners can benefit from their own understanding of how their own schemas influence their perception and learning. And instructors can, of course, benefit from knowing their learners' backgrounds at a high level. Okay, situated cognition. I really think that the environment, the learner, and the skill learned are deeply intertwined. I think communities of practice are a great takeaway from situated cognition. And of course, the idea of the school of hard knocks, the school of life. Now, how this theory can be applied in virtual and distance-mediated environments is still yet to be fully figured out, and so that's a question for me. I think my take here is that communities of practice and hard-earned experience are often more effective for learners than any planned formal approach, and that's a great thing to take away from situated cognition. Now, cognitive and knowledge development, that there is Jean Piaget, and I agree that schemas are constantly reconstructed to accommodate new learning, and we'll talk about constructivist principles in just a minute. But I think the rigidity of Piaget's four key stages of development really limit the reach of his theory. So my take here is that Piaget identified a linear progression for learning, but he fails to account for learning stages after relative adolescence. As an older person, I refuse to believe that learning growth and adaptation stops at so early an age. So now let's look at interactional theories of cognitive development. So I totally agree with Vygotsky's social formation of mind. I think the zone of proximal development is an excellent tool to help establish where a person is in terms of the nearest low-hanging fruit they can get to from a learning perspective. I think it's probably difficult to consistently assess it accurately. So my key takeaway here is that the elements of discovery learning benefit problem-oriented topics, and ZPD in particular is useful for both adults and children alike. Now, constructivism. I mentioned Piaget before. This is based a lot on his work. I agree that knowledge is constructed by learners as they make sense of their experiences. And I think that social learning and problem-based learning are great takeaways to apply in different contexts. But I question the theory, this theory that is often taken too far, particularly in K-12 contexts. I've seen this personally. Sometimes really good cognitive shortcuts, I'm thinking about mathematical shortcuts as an example, are ignored in favor of struggling to discover relationships. Okay, now we're going to talk about constructivism. We talked about Piaget a moment ago. Knowledge is constructed by learners as they make sense of their experiences. Totally agree with that. The takeaway here is that social learning is very effective. You can use that in different contexts well. Problem-based learning is a very effective means of getting people to think and engage with material. But I think that sometimes constructivism is taken a little bit too far, especially in the K-12 context. So I think it works well for problem solving and nonlinear type topics, but a balance has to be struck between what's been learned before and the potential of the new learner. All right, instructivism, as seen through the eyes of Robert Gagne. So um, the focus on objective-based learning and systems of conditions for learning, it's an easy fit for corporate learning and where I live. So Bloom's taxonomy, the systemic design of instruction, they all work well. I just think the rigidity of the system sometimes holds uh, up well for quantifiable topics, but it's a little less so for attitude and initiative type stuff. So I think his theories work extremely well in the corporate adult learning context, but learning can become quite forgettable if it's followed too closely. So to sort of critique my own personal learning theory, I think I have some strengths here. A lot of support for highly quantifiable and measurable topics in my theory. I have an eclectic blend of topics and approaches. I like the most effective idea to win, and I've got a good cookbook for certain adult learning challenges. But where I'm weak is in this collection of theories, my inability to specify how to apply some of the more cognitive approaches to learning. As an example, motivation, while it's still really important, is a totally mysterious aspiration, and I'm not exactly sure how to manipulate all the different key factors that contribute to motivation. I also don't really have a good prescription for things like attitudinal training. Now, in terms of limitations, I'm grounded mainly in adult learning principles and corporate learning environments. That's where I come from. So I don't really approach the learning really higher than the course or program level. I don't go into curriculum. I don't go into institutions. So, I've sidestepped some more complex models of training design in my personal learning theory. And the last thing I'd like to point out is that, my personal learning theory assumes that both adults and children can be curious, they can be distracted, they can be capable of learning anything, and motivated to learn quickly. I focus almost entirely on practical solutions. I would like to spend more time getting learning out there and into the hands and ears and eyes of students than sitting on it and theorizing too much. So I'm guiding by a simple principle. Does it work? Does it help? I also believe that there's a lot of great learning theorists, like the ones you see over here on the right, that are out there making huge marks on adult learning today, and they're not showing up in the academic journals because they're real practitioners. And so I have a mixed blend of heroes from a theoretical standpoint and heroes from a practical practitioner standpoint. That's about it. Thanks for paying attention to this.